All right. Well, it is 3:30, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone watching online here. This is our final Sustainable Energy Seminar of the spring 2025 semester. For those who are joining for the first time, welcome. If you've been here for all these seminars this semester, glad to have you here again. If this is your first time joining one of our seminars, my name is Scott Williams. I'm the Education Manager at the Wisconsin Energy Institute. And the Sustainable Energy Seminar is held every other week in the fall and the spring semesters. And our goal is to highlight the cutting edge energy research from across UW-Madison and beyond, and to showcase how different disciplines are understanding energy challenges and developing solutions. So throughout the series, we hear from experts in science and engineering, as well as social sciences and humanities, to learn about the ways in which they view sustainable energy challenges and solutions. This seminar is open to the public, but it's also a course for students in the undergraduate Engineering for Energy Sustainability certificate, as well as the Master's in Sustainable Systems Engineering. And this will be the last of the seminars for this semester. So we'll get started back up in September for the fall semester. And if you're on our mailing list already, or if you've signed up, we'll invite you to join our mailing list. And we'll let you know once registration is open for the fall 2025 semester. And once that registration is open, if you register once, you're automatically signed up for to be able to attend all 7 webinars in that semester. For those who need live captioning, you can click on the Show Captions button with that feature. And if you have a question for our presenter today, you can type that in the Q&A box, and if there's a good stopping point, I'll chime in and interrupt, and then we'll have some time for Q&A at the end as well. With that, I'll introduce today's presenter. Christopher Timmins is the Gary J. Gorman Affordable Housing Professor in the Real Estate and Urban Land Economics Department at the Wisconsin School of Business. And he specializes in urban and environmental economics, but he also has interest in industrial organization, development, and public and regional economics. And his recent research has focused on measuring the costs associated with exposure to poor air quality and the benefits associated with remediating brownfields and toxic waste under the Superfund program, as well as the evaluation of non-marginal changes and disamenities and the causes and consequences of environmental injustice. But today I'll be focusing more on the energy efficiency of the building sector and these perceived gaps in energy efficiency and what can be done about addressing some of that. So welcome, Professor Timmins.
Thanks. Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity to come and talk to you all. And we throw in a plug if anybody is interested in these kinds of topics. The material I'm going to be presenting here today is really material that I'm drawing from a new class that I'm working up that I'll be teaching next fall. It'll be Real Estate 651. It's open to students from across campus at all levels. And it's a green and sustainable housing class where we get into a lot of questions about both sort of how do you build sustainably in a way that we can sort of continue to do in the long run, and also in a way that will be healthy and for the people who need to live in those houses. And kind of draws on a lot of the work that I've done before I moved here just 2 years ago now. I was primarily an environmental economist and spent a lot of time working on questions sort of related to the intersection of urban and environmental topics, which brought me into a lot of work on environmental justice. So I'm interested in those topics too, if anybody out there ever wants to discuss. Today, though, I was going to focus on one particular aspect of the building side. And when Scott asked me if I could come and talk, given the nature of the class, I thought I'd focus on something that's much more energy specific. I understand it's a lot of engineers, and I think when economists come into contact with the engineering world, we often wonder why the purported gains in energy efficiency that the engineers tell us we would see from a lot of these technological improvements don't seem to pan out. That's what we're talking about when we get into the energy efficiency gap. Essentially, why is it that there is this gap between sort of the level of efficiency that we think we can reach and the gap and the level that we see in practice, and why in particular don't individuals adopt technologies that seem like they should be worthwhile for them. So we'll talk about that in general, and I'll kind of give a broad overview of the energy efficiency gap. And if there's time, I want to talk about one specific solution that's been proposed in the behavioral economics literature, which is to use this idea of nudges, which are sort of ways of altering the ways people go about making decisions to try to close the gap and get them to make better decisions. So I think I'll probably share, Scott, I'm guessing that, I could send you some of the materials that I'm using for these notes, and people would be welcome to look at them if there's questions or if you wanted to see anything in more detail. But here's sort of the broad takeaway of what I'd like you to get from today. In general, understand what we mean when we talk about the energy efficiency gap and why it's important. From a climate point of view and sort of from a broader environmental point of view, I think the reason we tend to focus on the energy efficiency gap is because if households are not adopting technologies that we think are important, that we think would help to reduce pollution, carbon use, things like that, then we're not going to see much in the way of response to the sorts of environmental policies that economists advocate for. So you could think about a carbon tax, or you could think about cap and trade policy, which would be something that's probably a little more practical and applicable. Those things aren't going to do much good if households and businesses are not adopting the technologies that we need to reduce carbon, to reduce our carbon emissions. So that gets into these questions we're going to talk about today as to why they wouldn't do that. We want to think about sort of what's the way the market breaks down. All right. So when we talk about this stuff in an economics world, we usually like to think about, where is the place in which, in markets, people are always behaving optimally. They're doing the thing that best benefits them. And in pure Adam Smith world, when markets work great, that behavior on its own gets us to a good outcome. Okay, so when we think about ways in which the market doesn't work, in this context, we're going to be thinking about externalities, which are when I burn something, I get some benefit from that. I get heat or I get energy, but I create something that harms other people. Okay, and they're not compensated for that harm, right? I don't have to pay them anything in exchange for burning something and getting benefits from it. That's a real common sort of market failure in the environmental economics world when we think about a lot. That's why we have a carbon tax, to try to internalize that externality. Investment inefficiencies, though, this is kind of where a lot of what we'll talk about today comes from. So this is households and businesses not investing in things that we think they should, right? And what's the reason why they don't? So we'll spend a decent amount of time going through what the theories are, and that suggests policy responses. Okay. Then, we can get into sort of those causes that will be, the explanations for that investment inefficiency, and then talk about specifically what would we do in response. Okay. So I like to start off a discussion about this with McKinsey. This is something that, interestingly, a lot of the world focuses on this one report that McKinsey put out in 2009. And if you work in the area of energy efficiency and climate, you've probably come across this. If not, you can go look it up online and read it. But essentially, the McKinsey report was famous for purporting that we would be able to essentially, get ourselves out of an energy crisis by looking for ways to sort of just reduce our energy use. Okay. So vast low-cost energy resource for the US economy isn't tapping shale gas. It's not importing oil from around the world. It's just reducing the amount of energy that we need to do basic things. Okay. And they talk in this report about massive amounts of energy reduction. Okay. So this was written back in 2009, and they say that if we were able to do the sorts of energy and efficiency improvements that are out there, we could reduce our energy use by up to 23% by 2020. Sorry, we haven't done that, and the question is why. But that's a big gain, right? I mean, if we could figure out a way to do that, that would solve a lot of problems, both from a climate perspective and from a geopolitical perspective. And there's just a lot of issues tied up there. So this is the most famous picture from that report, and it's one that I like to use an environmental economics class, so I'm just teaching the marginal costs of abatement of carbon. Okay, so what this basically shows you is an ordering of all the different things in the world that we could do to reduce carbon, and bigger bars reflect a bigger reduction. Okay, but you see there's a lot of little bars. And the y-axis is how expensive that activity would be. Okay, so you see a lot of positive numbers over here. These are things that are going to cost us money to do. Um, Carbon capture and storage is a really expensive way to get rid of carbon. So you see that's pretty high up the curve over here on the right. But over here on the left, there's a lot of things that McKinsey argued were basically going to reduce costs, right? These are net reductions. These are money laying on the ground, right? That firms are not walking up and just taking. If they were to do these things, it would be a win-win. They would reduce their carbon emissions at the same time as saving money. So why aren't they doing it, right? The fact that they aren't doing it in the economics world is usually a sign that something else is going on. In the McKinsey world, they would argue that, this is something where there just needs to be more information for managers, right? That they could be guided down this path. So that, in essence, right there is the energy efficiency gap. Whenever you have something with a negative cost associated with adopting it, that would do something good. And in particular, if it would do something good for the firm itself, right? So a private financial gain from adopting that technology. So we just went back one. You can see some of the technologies that are here. It's adopting energy efficient appliances in households. And that's something we're going to see in some of what I'm going to talk about, where you actually, as a homeowner, would save money by having this new appliance in your house, but you need to be there long enough, right? And you need to appreciate the benefits that are coming in the future. And possibly there are some costs to adopting that appliance that we as McKinsey or as social science researchers don't know about, right? And that could explain why households are not doing it, even when it would be a net savings. All right. So that's kind of what we want to get into. And if in the end, there are reasons why, um, you know, households and businesses are under adopting these technologies, there may be some scope for the government to step in and do something. We probably won't have time to get into a lot of it today, but some of the things, especially in the housing sector, that we think about are things like Energy Star, right? And LEED certification for a building, where it may not be valuable for a builder to put in lots of energy saving equipment, right? Good insulation, good appliances, things like that, if the buyer or the renter doesn't realize that those things are good and are going to save them lots of money in the long run, because then they're not going to be able to capitalize those gains into the rent or into the sale price, right? So if you have a nice sticker to put on the front of the building that says, this is LEED certified, or this is a passive house, or there's lots of other certifications out there, that can actually, solve that information problem at a relatively small cost. So there's these kinds of policies that are out there, things that we can do to fix the energy efficiency gap. Okay.
Quick question, sorry.
Yeah.
So Samantha asked, isn't that McKinsey chart quite old and out of date since it's from 2009 and things have moved along that chart since then?
Yeah, so I show this more to kind of emphasize the idea of people looking for $20 bills laying on the ground. The benefits, the actual things that are up here now and the things that are down here have changed technologically for sure. But there's still this idea that there are things that are, free money if firms are willing to take them. But there hasn't been sort of a follow-up report that would give you, um, an easy picture to look at. So this is the famous one. We'll go back and look at it. But essentially, I'm just trying to make a point that we're always going to have these ideas that are out there that that there's in some way firms are just giving up money, right? And that they could be doing something at a negative cost. But it's a good point that in reality, right, the technology has shifted quite a bit, and the things that we think are up top here are probably, some of these things are much less expensive nowadays than I think they were in 2009. solar in particular. I'm just noticing that there. Okay, but yes, thank you. That's a good question. Okay, so we've talked then about, the externalities from burning things. We've talked a little bit about imperfect information. I just told a story with builders about asymmetric information, and we'll get into some more specifics there. And then there's a third form of market failure that that will come up in a bit, where lenders and the fact that in order to do one of these projects and to do it in a big way, you usually have to borrow money. You don't usually have enough money laying around to install a big piece of capital equipment, and capital markets will sometimes not provide that money, for some of these same reasons that we're talking about. When we're talking about energy efficiency gaps, they could both be the private gap that we kind of just talked about was a firm or a household that doesn't do something that would be beneficial for them on just a purely financial basis, right? So this would actually save them money to buy this piece of equipment, but they don't. The social energy efficiency gap brings in the externality, right? The fact that we really should have a lot more energy efficient appliances, even more than might be useful from a purely private point of view, because that would give us the ability to use less energy, burn less stuff, and end up not inflicting costs on people outside of the house, right? That's actually installing the appliance. The social costs of carbon are kind of what enter into the social energy efficiency gap. So usually the social energy efficiency gap is bigger than the private one, because this is going to incorporate the fact that we should be using less energy in general, not just that a household is not using something that would be privately beneficial. Okay, so this is, I think, the only math. I'm gonna show you some statistical results as we go through, but this is, I think, as theoretical as we're gonna get. So this is really just a way to think about the decision that a household or a firm would make when they're deciding whether to adopt a piece of technology that would reduce their energy consumption, but possibly cost some more upfront. Okay, so this is really just a way to think about trade-offs. What we have here is essentially an inequality, which if the inequality holds, on the left, what we've got is the energy savings, the discounted present value of the energy savings from putting in, say, a new dishwasher, okay? On the right, what we have is the cost of doing that. So if the thing on the left, the reduction in these costs of installing a new dishwasher are bigger than the cost of doing it, we should see that household make that decision, okay? So then what we're going to see is a lot of households that don't make that decision, and we're going to have to ask the question why. So the pieces that are in here are the difference in the energy use. So let me highlight it. The difference in the energy use between the bad dishwasher that you could install sort of as a baseline, or the good dishwasher that would reduce your costs in the long run and use less energy, okay, but cost you incrementally more by amount C. M here is indexed by an individual. So this is going to tell us how intensively do people use that technology. So if M is really big, it means you're the kind of person who runs your dishwasher twice, 3 times a day. If M is really small, it means you run it once every other day, okay? So that's going to matter because we're going to see some people never adopting, and we're going to wonder why. And it could be because they're the kind of people who just run their dishwasher every other day. They're not going to get that much out of this, okay? And that's a hard thing to see as a policymaker. P is going to be the price of energy, right? And that's something that probably the people in this audience are going to know better than your average person on the street, but your average person has a very poor understanding of what they pay for a kilowatt of energy or what a kilowatt of energy gets them, okay? And even more so, what's that price of energy going to do going forward, right? And that's an even harder thing. Even if you do understand how energy works, knowing what prices are going to do in the future is tricky. In the denominator, we have an interest rate, right? So this gets into discounting of future values, time value of money, and things like that. If it's not something that you've thought a lot about, don't worry about it. It's just that we discount money that comes to us in the future. It's worth more to us today. And we use the interest rate to designate that, because if I give you money today, you can put it into the bank and it turns into more money tomorrow. So you'd rather have money today than money tomorrow, all else equal. Okay. Which means money tomorrow, we sort of reduce its value to us today. Kasai here, the Greek letter kasai, is thrown in as sort of a wedge to talk about unobserved costs and benefits of making that adoption decision. Okay, and we'll come back to this in a little bit in terms of some specifics, but you can think about this as being, a while ago, fluorescent light bulbs used to be the thing to install, right? This is before LEDs. But when fluorescent light bulbs were the thing, people would think about them and say, well, I don't really like the way the light looks, right? It bothers my eyes. It's not a great way to light a room. That would be a quality reduction in the use value of the light that would come along with the energy savings. Okay. So that's the kind of thing that we need to account for, because we might see a lot of people not making that adoption if they just don't like the technology for other reasons. Okay. I may not get to it later. In fact, I think probably it won't come up again. But we often talk about this implied discount rate. So let me just mention it now. If you look at this expression right here and you think about it, and we see somebody at one price failing to adopt, and then the price goes down a little bit, or I'm sorry, the price goes up a little bit, and then they do adopt, we can sort of back out from that what their discount rate on the future would have had to have been in order to have induced them to adopt the technology when they did. Okay, so this is really getting into the economics of it. But often what we do as economists is we try to back out how much people discount the future, and do they not think that much about future benefits of this technology? Do they overweight future benefits of the technology? And we do that by basically trying to recover the value of R in this expression that explains the decisions that people make. And that can be tricky because we don't really know what their expectations about price are. We don't really know what how much they dislike fluorescent light bulbs. We don't really know what their adoption cost is. Sometimes it's a pain in the butt to find somebody to come and install something, right? And that's hard to measure. And then this gamma parameter over here, I didn't really mention it. I should. I don't like to put things into equations and not talk about them. Gamma is simply here to reflect the fact that sometimes people over or underweight the benefits that they're going to get from something, right? And this gets into the behavioral part that we're going to talk about as we move forward. Okay, so that's all the math. It's not really math, it's more of just it's a framework for thinking about how decisions get made. Okay, but stop me, please, if there's any questions, anything about that isn't clear. Kind of what I'm going to do now is go through more, I'm going to talk with bullet points about the way that those various decisions get made and the trade-offs that face people. Okay. So we're going to think through, actually, yeah, here we go. We're going to think through a lot of different theories, and these are sort of theories in a very verbal way. Okay, we're not going to get into a lot of math, but we're going to think through behavioral theories about why people sometimes don't actually make the best decisions that they could. And it's all going to be based on that equation right there. The pieces are all floating around in here. I'm going to come back now and talk about each one of these, so I won't drag you through them twice. Let's just kind of jump in. Okay. So one theory that's out there as to why people don't adopt something when they should is that they don't really appreciate the long-term costs or benefits of making that technological decision, right? This is really about that discount rate. So if I'm going to save money over 20 years, I don't think about the 19th and 20th year very much when I'm deciding to put that light bulb in, all right, that LED. And it may be because I figure it's going to break before then. I figure I'm going to move and I'm not going to take it with me, right? There's a lot of reasons why people might discount the future more than we think they should, right? More than just a theoretical model would predict that they would. And in practice, that when I was talking about backing out the implicit discount rate, the implied discount rate, a lot of researchers have found discount rates trying to explain adoption behaviors that seem really big. Okay, so the one that I was referring to here, Jerry Hausman, famous economist from MIT back in the 70s, 80s, 90s. He had done a study of appliance adoption and found people were discounting the future, 20%, 25%. So, this is back in the early 80s. Excuse me. So those discount rates are not that far off from what people were paying for a mortgage, but they're still pretty high. And we think people probably that's not a rational thing to do from a purely economics point of view. We'll also think about sort of, it's not really myopia, but irreversibility, right? So if you value the present and you don't really want to give up the option of learning about something, right? And then wanting to make a different decision, but it's too late. So this kind of connects with the idea of uncertainty that we're going to come to in a bit. But if I think that there may be a better technology coming, I don't really want to, jump in early and buy this particular air conditioner. I want to hang out for another year or two and leave open the option of buying another one, even when maybe the people who know the technology would know that that's not really a rational thing to do. We can have inaccurate beliefs, right? So the price and the energy usage. A lot of people just have really bad ideas for what uses a lot of energy and what doesn't, okay? When they survey people, people tend to think that computers use a lot of energy because, they seem like they're doing quite a bit, whereas they think of space heaters as, they're pretty simple. They're probably not using a whole lot, but it's the exact opposite, right? I have an older house that I bought here in Madison when I moved here 2 years ago, and the electrical panel will crash and will blow out the fuse when I put the space heater on, but I can have multiple computers plugged in on the same circuit with no problem. So the engineers in the room will understand why that's the case. I just take it for granted not to plug in my space heater, and we seem to get by. So, what we need then is people to have more information. And one of the solutions to the energy efficiency problem is really about giving people feedback. So in particular, real-time feedback. How much energy are you using right now when you run 5 different appliances in your kitchen around dinner time and you start your dishwasher then? How much energy are you actually using, and what is the social cost of that energy is actually a really important thing to communicate, because when you start to use a lot of energy, everybody's using a lot of energy, you push your way up the curve in terms of running worse and worse power plants to generate that energy, and you actually inflict quite a bit of damage. Okay, so more information is kind of the solution here, obviously, when people have inaccurate beliefs, both about how much energy they're using and do they think that the price of gas is going to stay constant over time? Is it going to skyrocket? Is it going to plummet because we're going to have, some cheap source of energy that we're being promised coming out of shale gas lands or something like that? Who knows? But people have a lot of potentially, bad forecasts of the future. Okay, then we get into some of the real sort of I don't know, behavioral, psychological sorts of questions where we think about, bounded rationality, the fact that consumers of these goods don't actually have enough mental capacity to think through all of the models that engineers might create, okay? They need to, for instance, come up with heuristics, right, which are sometimes just sort of cheap solutions, cheap, easy ways to make decisions in complicated, information-rich environments, okay? So sometimes what that means is you get a reference point where you say, I'm going to behave like my neighbor behaves because I think they're environmentally friendly and I see them buy a Prius, so I should go buy a Prius, okay? Oftentimes what we see people do is engage in loss aversion, where they're far more worried about losing money than they are about saving money. Okay, so buying something really expensive that may give them a benefit over time doesn't always seem rational, because the upfront loss might seem way bigger than the potential gains that would accrue over many, many years. I'll go quick, so I don't want to run out of time before we get through things, but when you think about these misperceptions that people have because of bounded rationality and also inaccurate beliefs, the miles per gallon illusion is one idea of that we often talk about. Okay, and that people sometimes just don't understand or think through the math of a problem. So basically what it is just if you think about the ways that people buy cars, if you were going to go from having a 25 mile per gallon car to a 50 mile per gallon car, is that better, right? Going up in 25 miles per gallon in the car you're driving relative to going from a 10 mile per gallon car to a 15 mile per gallon car. So in preparing these talks, I've been asking random grad students and my wife and other people I run into, which one of these is better? And they generally all say, yeah, we definitely want to go, from the 25 mile per gallon car up to the 50 mile per gallon car. But, this gets into the actual math of what miles per gallon is. And if we were to do that transition that I just described, we'd basically save 2 gallons driving 100 miles. Whereas when you go from the 15 or the 10 to the 15 mile per gallon car, you save 3.3 gallons, right? So a pretty substantial percentage fraction increase. And it's simply because there's a diminishing marginal benefit to having higher and higher miles per gallon. If you think about the way miles per gallon work relative to the actual amount of gas that you're using, right? So the way we present information about things often is going to influence the way people make decisions, right? So a lot of what we've talked about doing in the car buying sector is replacing the sticker on the windows of cars with going from miles per gallon to gallons per mile, right? Because that's a much more direct measure of what you're saving in terms of both fuel costs and harm to the environment. Okay, when we get into deeper questions about information, there's ideas about uncertainty and salience. So this is simply the case that people don't think about things that they don't think are super important. This picture here, I think, is kind of useful because what economists and psychologists have figured out by looking at these things over time is that consumers buying a house or firms buying a piece of equipment will pay more attention to something when the energy costs are a much bigger fraction of the purchase price, okay? So what we have here are the energy costs from a variety of different energy saving appliances down here on the bottom. And you can see, the energy cost from a house is quite big. The energy cost from a light bulb is quite small. It's a log scale over here. And the diamonds reflect the percentage of the purchase price, okay, in ratio over here. So 10 down to a fraction of 10 or a fraction of 1, that the energy costs reflect out of the purchase price. So the energy costs are a pretty small fraction of the house, right? But they're a pretty big fraction of the light bulb. So people will pay a lot more attention to the energy side of it when they're buying the light bulb than they do when they're buying the house. Okay. And this is simply something where we need to raise the salience in the decision-making process. So a lot of what this comes down to in the world of nudges and in the world of psychology and behavioral economics is finding ways when people are buying a house to put the energy information in front of them. And some of the material that I teach when I talk about disclosures is exactly about that. So cities have passed laws requiring that homeowners disclose the energy efficiency of the home in a document that's presented to any would-be buyer when they show up to tour, okay? What realtors have found when you survey realtors about that is the people don't really even understand necessarily what they're looking at when they see these indices of how energy efficient the house is, but simply the fact of having them think about it at all usually steers them in the direction of a more energy efficient home. Right? So there's different ways to do that kind of information presentation, but people don't always have as good of an understanding as we think they do. Okay. So that's sort of uncertainty and how how much do people recognize what's going on. information asymmetry, everybody can have a pretty good understanding of things, but some people have a better understanding than others because they have information that other people don't. Okay, that's the specific difference here. So this is the idea I was talking about earlier, where it's really hard for somebody selling their house to tell a potential buyer that the insulation in the house is really, really good, right? And that you should pay me more for my house because the insulation is so good. This is where it could be helpful to have a disclosure policy where we're going to have somebody come in and, check the amount of heat that leaves the house and write up a report that you can show to a potential buyer, right? But in the absence of that, the buyers aren't going to pay me for the investment I would make in things like the insulation in my walls. So that's going to reduce my incentive as a homeowner to want to make that investment. I may make it for myself, but the goal here is, I might move in 5 or 10 years, and I'm going to need to basically recoup the rest of that benefit by selling it to somebody when they buy. So the problem then is a seller, an owner, loses the incentive to make that investment. And the Lemons model in economics, and this actually comes from a discussion about used cars, is that the only things for sale then tend to be, bad used cars, because good used cars don't ever make it to the market because somebody selling a used car can't convey the fact that it's a good one. So they basically don't sell it on the used car market, right? Or in the housing sector, all the houses that are for sale are gonna have really lousy insulation because people who are selling their house have no incentive to upgrade it. So there are ways to fix that. You can do these sorts of standards, policies, certifications, right? I was just at the opening of a passive house, a certified passive house building here in Madison. Last week, one of the developers who works with us in the business school here was the builder. Um, and the house is amazing. It actually does reduce energy use by close to 70% relative to standard code building. But nobody would ever know that walking in. Everything that makes that house energy efficient is packed away behind walls. You never see it. Maybe if you really know your windows, you'd look at the window and say, that window is saving me money. But in general, it looks just like a standard house. So you need that certification, which comes from the International Passive House Foundation, the ones who come up with the criteria for this. And then once people know that, they're willing to pay more to live there because they actually know my energy bill is going to be smaller if I live in this building. Okay. Then you can even take it one step further when we talk about the housing market, and this gets us into the rental market in particular. Okay, so here what we have is a situation where landlords, right, typically are not the ones who pay utility bills. So in about 13% of rental units in the US, the landlord pays the utility, and the remainder of the renter pays it. All right. The problem then is that the person who's making the decision about what kind of dishwasher to put into the apartment, what kind of windows to put in, things like that, right, has no incentive to do the thing that costs more upfront that will save money down the road, because they're not going to be the one saving that money. The renter is going to be the one saving the money. So what they could do, like the passive house example I was just talking about, that was actually a multifamily rental unit. By having the passive house designation, they know a renter coming in will know that their energy bill is going to be lower going forward, right? So they'll be willing to pay more in rent to live there. So it's worth it for the builder, for the landlord, for the property manager to make those investments. A passive house is kind of an extreme example, but just simple things like putting in an energy efficient refrigerator or a good dishwasher. Those kinds of decisions matter a lot. But what we see in this is a paper here that I cover when I do a whole class on the split incentive problem. But you're far less likely to have an Energy Star dishwasher or washing machine in your apartment if you're a renter versus an owner. So going back and forth between the two kinds of ownership, you're far more likely to have oil rather than gas as your heating, right? Which is a less efficient, costlier way to do home heating. So we see that a lot. There's other examples that are out there. in terms of what makes these things tick. Okay, unobserved adoption costs. You remember earlier I had that Kasai up there. It was sort of the wedge in the inequality. This is one where there's just oftentimes things we don't think about that make people not want to go through the hassle of doing an installation. I don't have it on the slide here, but we actually talk a lot about the Weatherization Assistance Program in a class like this. This is a federally funded program. It's actually still there, but most of the staff to administer the program has been cut, so it's unclear kind of how the money is going to get distributed in the current environment. But in the past, it has gone out, to people, usually gives them about $5,000 worth of improvements to their house that will save them a lot of energy going forward. But it's really hard to get people to actually sign up for the program. Okay, and people have studied why is it so hard to get people to take $5,000 worth of free upgrades to their home, and it's because you have a lot of people digging around in your walls and in your house for days and weeks doing this sort of installation, doing all of these improvements, and that's a hassle for people. Okay, in the UK, they did a study about why people won't take insulation for their attic. And what they found was it's because people don't like to have to move everything out of their attic, right? I mean, your attic has stuff in it that you've dumped up there decades ago. You don't want to get it out. You don't want to have to move it. When they came in with a program that would offer to move everything out of people's attics and then put it back when the program was done, the application, the participation in this program shot up. Okay, so little things like that can make a big difference. Something to keep in mind. And then there's other sort of modeling problems. In a second, we'll get into the engineering estimates, but a lot of this has to do with the way engineers do these sorts of estimates. So actually, let me jump to this. When engineers typically talk about the way that energy efficiency works, they're usually thinking about a lab, right? Or they're thinking about a lab type environment where things are clean and they run according to the way they're supposed to, according to the manual, okay? But often what's happening, the things that don't get incorporated have to do with, stuff breaks and you have to maintain it over time, and that's going to cost money. You have to then have people on your staff who will be willing to make those improvements, who will be responsible for maintaining things. When you put expensive, new, complicated technology like some programmable thermostats and things like that into apartment buildings, what they found is oftentimes the people who are living there don't want to invest the time into doing the programming. Right? They're not that invested in it in the first place, and the equipment typically breaks or doesn't get used. So there's a lot of problems when you take things from the lab and put them in the field. Okay. One of those problems that I'm just going to bring up here in parentheses, but we could do an entire discussion about this, is the rebound effect. Okay, so this is a very behavioral idea where when you give people a cheaper way to get the benefits from some technology, right? I can run my dishwasher now for 30% less than it was before, costing me. I might start running it twice a day, so that I always have clean dishes. My dish cabinet is full. I don't need to worry about running out of forks. When things were expensive, because I had a crappy dishwasher, it was in my mind not to run it all the time. I was being very careful. I'd only run it when it was totally full. Okay. And what they find is in a lot of settings, people responding by consuming more energy because the cost of the energy that the services they're getting has gone down is a real hit to the energy savings that you would hope to get from these things. Okay, I think we're running out of time. So let me just jump actually here to sort of the tools. And we've kind of touched on some of these already, so I don't need to spend a lot of time and we take questions. But a lot of the tools that we use to address this kind of a gap, have to do with information. Okay, so we've already talked about disclosure where you can do audits. Then a seller can hand a buyer a form saying this is how much money you're going to save in energy if you buy my house. We can give people information so that they know what they're actually using, because oftentimes they have no idea. We can label appliances, right? So if it's really hard for me to figure out what's a good dishwasher, I can just walk through, the appliance store and just look for the Energy Star label and just go to that. I don't need to think. We could be more direct, right? We could actually say people aren't going to figure this out with information. So let's put rebates on things. Let's give them tax credits. Okay. The problem here, if you go back to that little m, the heterogeneity term that we had in there before, is that the people who will be most likely to take the tax credits and the rebates are the people for whom they're going to run their dishwasher a lot because they generate a lot of dirty dishes, right? For them, they were going to buy the better dishwasher anyway, and now we're just basically handing them money. The thing we'd like to do is figure out a way to target the rebate and the tax credit to the person who wasn't going to buy the good dishwasher, and now we need to induce them to get over the line to do it. And that's a tricky thing to do. You think that there's problems just sort of practically with that. There's problems ethically with that. How do we hand out money? So then typically what we do is we just fall back on standards. So let's just say you have to make your dishwashers perform at a certain level. That way people will just buy whatever they buy, and we don't really have to worry that much about inducing them to do anything. Cafe standards with cars, same basic idea. And then finally, if we can fix all these information problems, we give people the tools then to actually figure out a way to, use less energy when we impose a carbon tax, which is kind of the ultimate goal. We want to have the the cost of using energy reflect the cost that it's imposing on society. But if people don't know how to do that, if they don't know how to reduce their energy because they don't understand the way the technology works, they're going to have a really hard time succeeding in that goal. So, the ultimate goal here is to be able to make cap and trade policies, make a carbon tax, make something like that more effective by putting all of these energy efficient technologies into play. Okay, I'll stop there because it's already 4:17, and Scott, you said go till 4:15. So that's probably a good place to stop, but I'm happy to sort of answer any questions about this or things that I alluded to along the way.
Yeah, sounds great. Yeah, we've got a few questions that have come in, and I'll just kind of read them and have you respond.
Okay.
So Ken was this is more of a comment maybe, but get your reaction. Is it says there's a new home building just down the street, probably 5,000, 6,000 square feet, with no concern about efficiency. Will probably have a hot tub too. Is there any hope?
Um, that's it. Yeah, that is that's the kind of question I think about a lot. I mean, I do actually see in the world here over in the real estate department, I run into a lot of builders who would never dream of building that house and that are really, really focused on building the sort of like the passive house I was just talking about. So yes, I think there is hope. But this is kind of a broader question. It's not the question that you asked him, but this is something that I think about a lot. I think oftentimes we put too much emphasis on trying to guide people into doing things voluntarily. And I'm actually a big fan of sort of well thought out government regulations that tell people what to do, right? Or at least impose strict price costs on doing things like building a 6,000 square foot house with a hot tub. So you're fine to go and do that, but if you want to do it, you're going to pay a lot for it and for the energy to power up that hot tub. And if somebody still wants to do that, great. It's up to them to spend their money that way. But I think that alone would steer many, many people into a different kind of building. So this is the environmental economist in me talking, saying that I think in reality what we need are, actually good, solid regulations that the EPA is enforcing and internalizing all of these externalities, and then a lot of these problems disappear.
Thanks. And then Current asks, in what way are we dealing with externalized benefits as well as externalized costs? So any costs or benefits that we don't see that don't motivate us individually. And if those benefits that accrue to society at large, then a future me or present me won't really act. So how do we deal with that kind of external benefits or uncertainty that
Yeah.
maybe we don't act as well because of that?
I mean, so yeah, the external benefit is really the flip side of the Pigouvian, well, it's the flip side of the carbon tax. So we subsidize things that we think people don't do enough of when they're good, and we tax things that we think people do too much of when they're bad. So you can think about this as being a discussion we've had today all about exactly that question. We don't think people buy enough energy efficient appliances. So one option would be to subsidize them. And a Pigouvian subsidy would pay them for the benefit that that dishwasher is going to create for society in general. It's going to help pay them, and that will induce them to maybe get over the line and make that purchase. We've seen a lot of this. There's been a lot of rebate programs in the last 20 plus years. There were a lot after 2008 when they were putting money back into the economy after the financial collapse. The Inflation Reduction Act had a lot of rebates in it, things that would, try to get people to make that slightly better purchase on the margin, right? So that's exactly what we're talking about here with subsidies.
And yeah, maybe a follow on to that, given the change in administration and the priorities of the administration, a lot of talk about kind of rolling back things from the IRA. Like, how do you see things moving forward on addressing the energy efficiency gap, given that there's maybe less emphasis at the federal level, or the importance isn't seen as high?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that it's definitely a problem. I think the IRA, there are things that, I mean, I'm an environmentalist slash environmental economist. So I'm very much, I liked a lot of what was in the IRA. I also thought there were a few things that made it in there that probably were not the most efficient way to solve problems, but that's kind of the way government policy works. But overall, definitely, I think it did good things, and cutting those policies is not going to be good. Um, I think a lot of the bigger problems, though, that we're going to see are going to come simply from the fact that we are losing our enforcement of a lot of regulations. So a lot of what we do in the US to solve environmental problems is not as elaborate as a carbon tax, right? It's not as sort of economically pure. It's basically just a standard. It's a regulation. You can't dump this much stuff into the river. And when we stop enforcing that, we're gonna pay for that. People will start coming out with measures of the number of deaths like that can be associated with the changes in policies that we're seeing in place. That'll happen because there are a lot of deaths that happen from environmental problems, from bad air quality, from bad water quality, many more than you'd think, like tens of thousands. And that we're going to start to see that. It's out there. It's unfortunate, but it's there.
Right. Next question. What would a cost benefit analysis be for the passive house that you described? Say, the upfront extra costs versus the energy cost savings over 10 years?
Yeah, I mean, I was actually really interested in that because I went to the opening, and the developer who built it is a good, like, he's a friend here, and I definitely am in favor of the building. But I was looking at it thinking this thing must have cost a fortune because they're just talking about the number of screws that they had to put into the wall to make it to make it. It's all about having a tight envelope that no air can come in and out of. But he said it was only 8% more expensive. I'd like to see I'd like to figure out how that could be the case, because if that's the case, we should definitely build more of them, and I believe him. But in that case, I think it would pass cost benefit because the energy savings, a 70% reduction in energy is huge. And you don't need to have super expensive gas or electricity in the future to justify that. I think you get into technologies. There's another building code certification, sorry, called the Living Building Challenge, which gets into regenerative building, which is actually supposed to buildings that will take carbon out of the atmosphere, right? Which sounds good. But I think that there may be cheaper ways to take carbon out of the atmosphere than building buildings that have grass on them and things like that. So, I mean, there's benefits to that, but I think they don't all pass cost benefit. And honestly, to figure out if they pass cost benefit, we have to, as a society, come up with a social cost of carbon that we're going to stick with, right? And that's something that changes with every presidential administration. So cost benefit analysis in general is very difficult. Yeah.
Thanks. And I'm going to combine a couple things that Sandy posted. One is just a link to a talk that was given a few years ago on the LED and rebound effect from that. And then also just a question of whether or not you look at life cycle assessment, especially for residential buildings in your work.
Yeah, no, that comes up a lot in the sustainable and affordable class in particular. And when I'm talking to developers like the guy who built the Passive House building, a lot of what we talk about is sort of, yeah, what's going to happen. So the building sector is one of the biggest contributors to waste and landfill waste and waste in general in the world. And what's going to end up happening to the buildings when they come down, because they eventually do. A lot of the discussion is about building things that will last longer. And this is really important too in the affordable sector, because what we end up with there is buildings that need to go on for 15, 30, 50 years in order to maintain their affordability status. When they get to be if they start to fall apart, people will come in, knock them down, and build something market rate. So you really want to build something that has lasting power. But there's a lot of confluence between building things that will last a long time and building things that are environmentally friendly. And there's a lot we could say there, but I have at least a week of material in the class in 651 on that. So come and take that class if you'd like to hear a lot of details.
Um, Samantha asked, how would Rogers' technology adoption curve fit into this discussion?
That's probably getting outside of my somebody will you'll have to tell me what the Rogers technology adoption curve
I
is.
wonder if that's like the S curve with technology adoption. I'm just throwing it out there. I'm not quite sure either of that term.
Yeah, well, I don't know. Sorry, I'll have to pass on that one.
All right. Yeah, and I guess another kind of question slash comment of how do we make things sort of the default, just because people want to live their lives and kind of do their so how do we make it the default rather than trying to ask people to do a lot by adopting these technologies?
Yeah, so it's actually if we had gotten into the nudges discussion, one of the key ways in which behavioral types try to influence behavior is by, for instance, making the default energy setting on a new appliance something that is the more energy efficient. Like, you're not going to get the water as hot in the dishwasher, but it's good enough and it's not going to use nearly as much energy. Make that the setting that the thing comes in the box, right? And then if you want to make it different, you have to figure out how to program it with the pad, and people just say, forget it, I don't have that much time. They just hit run, and we save a lot of energy, right? You can have people default into various energy saving programs, and they have to opt out. They have to ask to be taken out of those programs. That's the sort of thing that that we do a lot in the behavioral world with nudges, is really just setting things up so that people don't have, when people don't do anything, they're doing the right thing.
Great. And next question from Jim. Does research give any indication of how information quality or consumer understanding in this field is best improved? For example, through utility outreach or municipal government, K-12 schools? Also, is the efficiency gap larger for residential or commercial buildings?
Oh, the residential versus commercial is an interesting one. You usually see most of the discussion about residential, but there are a few studies that have tried to look at the role of Energy Star in commercial. And it's a murky field where there's a lot of different output. So it's a good, I didn't really talk about commercial real estate. I've been talking mostly about residential, but that's a great question. But it's a complicated question. The best way to give out information, I mean, the thing is with nudges, what they found is that you can sort of give this information out in easily digestible ways, but the impact that it has tends to be very short-lived. If it's sort of very easy to take and incorporate, people forget about it. They found that bringing it into schools is actually a great way to get a long-lasting effect. They talk about pairing up the nudges and putting, for instance, a little card into your energy bill that has a smiley face on it if you're doing well relative to your neighbors. That's a way to get people to behave well, but they tend to forget quickly. But then if you teach their kids in school about, why you should turn off lights when you leave the room, that sort of thing tends to have a longer lasting impact. So when they talk about doing this stuff, they usually talk about it as sort of all approaches way of doing it. But the municipal bills and providing information there, it has been proven to be pretty effective. 2% reduction in energy use simply from giving people a comparison to their neighbor. That we would have talked about that if I had saved time to talk about nudges.
Sounds good. And then Wes, I see you have your hand up, so I'll let you unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yeah, this is a little orthogonal, my questions. Thanks, Christopher, for this presentation. It's very nice to hear somebody from the business school talking about things. And you're probably aware of the energy analysis and policy program here, which I've been able to observe over the last 30 or 40 years. At the beginning of it, we used to have quite a few business professors and students participating in it. But in the last, I would say, 20 years, there have been only, I think, a few business students, if I'm correct. Scott can tell you more about that. And I'm kind of wondering what you think about that, whether business students aren't really interested in some of the things that you're talking about, which I think are very relevant and very important. And I wonder if the fact that they aren't has an influence on the behavior of the business sector.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting question because I think it can differ within the business school even. I think that I've seen a lot of interest among students in the real estate side who want to do development, and the ones who are sort of environmentally minded view this as very much a technological engineering problem. It boils down to that. The economics is interesting, but in the end, it's all about energy technology. I think for a lot of the other fields within the business school, they've kind of gravitated away from places where technology enters directly. It's not universally true. But a lot of the other fields, I think they're maybe one step removed from actually, building something. I do, however, I'm tomorrow night, I'm going to talk at a roundtable for the sustainability group here, the student sustainability group in the business school. And I think they have a pretty big membership. So I think there's growing interest, and it could just be that we need to get people connected with other parts of campus better.
Oh, that's great to hear. We used to have a person in the risk area, which is very relevant to some of these things. And then also somebody in the utility area, regulation and utility economics and so on.
Yeah, there are a number of people currently in the risk group here who do environmental work. They focus a lot on natural disasters and on, for instance, how to build houses to be more resilient to hurricanes, right? And if you do that, you can actually get insurance companies to lower their premiums or possibly even still offer to sell insurance policies in places where they won't. So there's a very direct relationship between the technology and the engineering and the economics.
Yeah.
And people talk about that a lot now here. So I think we're
Great.
moving back in that direction.
Great. Glad to hear that.
Well,
thanks.
Well, thanks. And we're a little over time, but I want to thank you, Professor Timmins, for your talk today, and great questions from the audience here. And hope you all have a great summer, and hope to see you all for the seminar starting in September. So have a good one.
Thank you.